In this video, I want to talk about the notion of deductive validity, and I also want to talk about two intuitive tests that we might use to test arguments for deductive validity. I think the starting point, though, is to think real generally about how we evaluate arguments. That is, what are the criteria that we employ when we say an argument is good or bad? In general, there are two main criteria. The first is to see if the argument says all true things. So if an argument consists of reasons, or what are sometimes called premises, and a conclusion, that is the proposition you reason to, we want to make sure that all of the propositions in the argument itself, all of its parts, are true. We don't want an argument that says a bunch of false things. If it says all true things, then we say this is a good feature of an argument. And if it says a bunch of false nonsense, then we say it's a bad feature of the argument. So the first criteria is, does it say all true things? The second criteria that we employ is whether or not the conclusion follows from the premises. I can say a bunch of true things. I can say, I'm 6 foot tall, my name is David Wells Agler, but none of these are kind of connected to each other. They're just sort of random facts. But when we put forward an argument, generally there's this thing, it's called the conclusion. That is what is supported by premises, reasons, or evidence. And so we want to make sure that as the other feature of a good argument is that the conclusion actually follows from those premises. It's a bad feature of an argument if it doesn't follow from the premises. So it's important to separate these two criteria. We can have a case where we have an argument that says all true things, that is, all the parts of the argument are true, but the conclusion does not follow from the premises. Take the example, the sky is blue, which is true, therefore the grass is green. While both of the propositions are true, the conclusion, the grass is green, doesn't really follow from the premises, even in the intuitive sense. In the second case, we can have an argument where we have all false propositions in an argument, but the conclusion nevertheless follows. An example of this would be, all pigs fly, I am a pig, therefore I fly. Each one of these propositions is false. Nevertheless, intuitively, the conclusion follows from the premises. So logic is more focused on the notion of deductive validity, and so I think that's a place to focus in on. So I'll start by giving you a definition of what it means for an argument to be deductively valid. And I'll give you two definitions, but they both mean the same thing. They're just expressed in different ways. So the first definition, the one I use normally, is an argument is deductively valid if and only if it is impossible, and that's an important word, so it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Here's an equivalent way of saying the same thing. An argument is deductively valid if and only if it's necessarily the case that if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. So there's 2 points I want to kind of be clear on with respect to the notion of deductive validity. The first is that you can have a deductively valid argument even though all of the propositions in the argument are false. So you could have false premises and a false conclusion. Nevertheless, the argument can be deductively valid. That is, it can be impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. And this brings me to my second point. Another way of thinking about the notion of deductive validity is as a kind of negative property. It tells you something that cannot occur with respect to an argument. And what it says is that it's impossible, or it cannot be the case, or there's just no way a particular state can happen. And that state is that the premises or reasons or evidence in the argument are true, and at the same time the conclusion is false. So it's not telling you, one way of thinking about it is not telling you what is the case, it's instead telling you is what cannot be the case. It can't be the case that the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So I think people learn to grasp this notion of deductive validity by applying it to cases. But in order to apply it to actual arguments, we need some method of application of this notion. And I think there are two intuitive tests to see if an argument is deductively valid. The first and most common test is there's not a good term for it, but we might call it the gut test or the logical intuition test or the logical sense test. Basically, it's a case where you look at an argument and you say, I see that argument and I know it's deductively valid. It's almost like you can actually see or visualize that deductive validity in the argument itself. This is the most common way that this notion is applied. People just feel a certain way about an argument and they say, that has to be deductively valid. Now, obviously, this method of application and identification has some serious problems. Here are just 3 of them, but there are many problems. The first is, well, why do we get so much variation with respect to the use of this particular test? You and I might look at an argument and come to different conclusions. You might say the argument is valid, I might say it's invalid, and you see this all over the place with rampant disagreement about argument. So the first problem with a test is it gives us wide variation. Our guts just tell us different things. The second problem is that there's no reason bias can't affect this particular method. Where a lot of people are affected by political bias or are cultivated in a certain way by education or society, and there's no reason that our logical sense is an infallible machine or power. And so the objectivity of this particular test is in question. We might just get whether or not an argument is valid or not incorrect. The third one is, I would say, people tend not to have or employ this particular test, or it doesn't work well when you think about large arguments that deal with technical subject matters. So if you give someone a simple argument, maybe 2 premises and a conclusion, they might have this logical gut feeling that it's valid or invalid. But if you give them a large argument with hundreds of premises about a matter they're unfamiliar with, the logical power that they claim to have just doesn't seem to work, and they can't tell you one way or the other if the argument is deductively valid or not. So I don't think this particular method of determining an argument is deductively valid, even though it is the most commonly employed one, is a very good one for our purposes. So I think it's worthwhile to transition to a second intuitive method for determining an argument is deductively valid. The second test that I want to talk about is called the human imagination test, or just the imagination test or imagination method. Sometimes it can be called the negative test, but in general it's called the imagination test. The test is pretty straightforward. When you are given an argument, you simply try to imagine the premises being true and the conclusion false. And if you can imagine the premises being true and the conclusion false, then it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. And if it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, then the argument is invalid. On the other hand, if you cannot imagine the premises being true and the conclusion false, then it looks like it is not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. And if it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, then the argument is said to be valid. To state this one more time, all you do when you use the imagination test is try to imagine the premises true and the conclusion false. If you can imagine the premises true and the conclusion false at the same time, then it's invalid. If you cannot, then it's valid. In order to get a better grip on the imagination test, it's helpful to apply it to some examples. So here is a very simple example. All humans are angry. John is a human, therefore John is angry. To determine if this argument is deductively valid or not, we simply apply the imagination test. That asks us to imagine the premises being true and the conclusion false. And so I start by trying to imagine that every single human is angry and that John is a human. Okay, I do this and I can do this. I can imagine those 2 propositions being true. And now I try to imagine the conclusion false. That is, I try to imagine the conclusion that John is angry is false. So I'm trying to imagine that John is not angry. And I try to do this, but I just can't. I can't imagine simultaneously that all humans are angry, that John is a human, and also that John is not angry. So this shows me, since I can't imagine the premises being true and the conclusion false, at least according to the test, the argument is deductively valid. If I can't imagine the premises being true and the conclusion false, then it looks like it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. And if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, then the argument is deductively valid. Let's look at another simple example involving the imagination test. This one is, some men are millionaires. I, David Agler, am a man, therefore I'm a millionaire. So again, employing the imagination test, I imagine the premises being true. I imagine that there are some people and they are millionaires. I'm going to imagine that I'm a man, and now I'm going to try to imagine the conclusion is false. That is, I'm going to imagine that I am not a millionaire. And this is pretty easy to do because I'm not close to being a millionaire. And so I can imagine the premises being true and the conclusion is false. And since I can do this, it looks like it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. And if it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, then the argument is not valid. That is, it is invalid. So let's look at a more problematic example. I sometimes use this example in a classroom, and it's always amusing because you expect to get different results when you use it, but you tend to get the same results year after year. And in this example, you get conflicting results about whether or not the argument is valid or invalid. So the argument goes like this. Some basketball players are millionaires. Some millionaires drive fancy cars. Therefore, some basketball players drive fancy cars. Rather than me directly telling you whether or not the argument is valid or invalid, it's worthwhile to kind of pause for a second and think about it for yourself. And rather than me just directly telling you again, maybe it can be helpful for me to articulate both sides of, or both lines of reasoning concerning whether the argument is valid or invalid. So to help with this, I'm going to bring in my brother here who will tell me that the argument is invalid. Hey bro. Argument valid, completely valid. If you think about it, some basketball players, they are millionaires, true. Some millionaires drive fancy cars, also true. Conclusion, some basketball players drive fancy cars, also true. And if you think about it, people with money, what do they do with that money? They buy fancy cars. So I think it's just likely, if you look at basketball players too, you know, they drive fancy cars. So I'm gonna go with valid on this. See you, bro. So the argument involving basketball players is not valid. That is, it's invalid. The reason is because it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. And the imagination test shows us this because we can ask ourselves, can we imagine, not whether it is the case, but can we imagine, one, that some basketball players are millionaires and some millionaires drive fancy cars? Yes, we can imagine this. Now it's asking us, can we at the same time imagine the conclusion false? And the answer is yes, we can imagine the premises being true and the conclusion false. We can imagine, one, that there are millionaire basketball players, that some millionaires drive fancy cars, but for whatever reason, no basketball player drives a fancy cars. They take a limo to practice or to games. They ride a bicycle. They take taxis. They take an Uber. They use some other form of transportation than actually driving a fancy car. And so it's possible to imagine the premises being true and the conclusion false. And so if it's possible to imagine that is, I actually can imagine that, then the argument is not valid. The last thing I want to touch on, and this is worthwhile to touch on because it gives you a good motivation for studying logic, are some limitations associated with the imagination test. There are a number, but I'm going to mention maybe 3 just really briefly. The first is that the method has a subjective element to it. And since it's subjective, since it depends upon the use of a human individual to apply it, it's subject to biases and certain limitations. So the first problem would be, since it makes this connection, this bridge between what is in fact possible and what we can or can't imagine, I might say, I just can't imagine the premises being true and the conclusion false. And you might say, no, I can imagine that. And so we can get this difference of opinion concerning what we can and can't imagine. There might be some things I just have difficulty conceptualizing because I just have a weak imagination. The other aspect is, what do we do about really large scale arguments? If I can imagine maybe small, simple arguments with 2 or 3 or 4 premises, I can hold all of that in my mind. But if I'm given an argument with 20 premises and asked to say, can I imagine all 20 of these premises being true and the conclusion false? I might start to become a little bit uncertain as to whether or not I can hold all of that in my mind. And related to that, if we think about these more mathematical creations that are not picturable by the mind, like 4-dimensional figures or something along those sorts, we might say, well, I don't even think I can picture that or imagine it by picturing it in my head. And the third limitation associated with the imagination test is not whether or not we have these sort of educated or cultivated biases, but there might be just general cognitive, natural biases that are the result of evolution. I can talk about this more in another video, but if I have these inbuilt cognitive biases, this might impact my capacity to imagine certain scenarios or not imagine, or say I can't imagine a particular scenario. And so the problem associated with the amount of information associated with an argument, as well as certain limitations associated with human imagination, causes us to say, well, we'd really like a different method. And logic is really interested in providing you that additional method in the form of mechanical methods, which I'll look at or talk about in future videos. So in this video, I think I accomplished 3 things. The first was to distinguish 2 criteria used for evaluating arguments. There's the criteria that's employed when we say that the argument says all true things, and then there's this notion of a conclusion following from the premises. In this vague notion of following from the premises, we can more fully articulate that through the notion of deductive validity. This brings us to the second point. The second point was the definition of deductive validity. And that was, an argument is deductively valid if and only if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. And then the third thing that we looked at was how to test for deductive validity. And we didn't use a formal or mechanical or logical test. Instead, we used a more intuitive test. We talked about the gut feeling test, and then also this imagination test, as well as the limitations associated with both of these tests.